Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. In this video, folks, we're going to talk a little bit about how brute forcing change just doesn't work. Now, on the face of it, it would seem pretty obvious, right? Brute forcing just doesn't work. I remember, this is obviously a childhood example. I remember my mom, when I don't know how old I was, but I was very small. My mom was wanting me to eat canned spinach, okay? Not a fan of spinach, to be honest with you, unless it's mixed into a salad or something, cooked wise. But she was trying to get me to eat canned spinach, right? I don't know. That's a triggering food right there. But here's what she did. She tried to, she was like, hey, eat your spinach, da da da, the whole thing, right? Sounds like a meme. Just eat your spinach, don't eat, whatever. But no, she tried to get me to eat spinach. And I wasn't normally too resistant to a lot of foods, although cooked vegetables, I'd rather eat most anything raw, vegetable-wise, but when I was a kid. But anyway, so the spinach thing. And so she thought she was going to be pretty slick about it, right? So she was going to serve it with pizza. So I can't remember back then, whatever, pizza. And so it was pizza and spinach. I don't know. I've had, since as an adult, I've had, spinach that was on pizza, and it's fine. It's whatever. It's fine. It's mixed in. It's not a problem. You just can't do the straight on cooked canned type spinach. But anyway, she tried to do this, right? And it didn't work. And I just kind of, just waited it out, right? just kind of anchored in and waited it out. And she was kind of pleading with me, and it's like, well, you can't go outside and play because there's, more daylight left. It must have been nearish summer or something. And you can't go outside and play until you eat your spinach, right? and I never did end up eating a spinach. It just was not happening, right? Now, was I hard-headed? Probably was. And what's funny is I'm not really hard-headed when it comes to such things. But for some reason I was then, and just wasn't going to do the spinach. But she didn't, she leaned into it, but she didn't brute force it, right? And I use this example, not because we, should push away from eating the things we should, because in, all honesty, I should have eaten the doggone spinach, right? But it is true. If you try to go beyond, right? If you're going beyond a normative flow, right? To change, right? And you're going to introduce an abrupt change. Okay, we can say the spinach was an abrupt change. That if you try to brute force that, right, you're more apt to push people away from the change that you're trying to, get to, right? And it's especially difficult because oftentimes let me preface, we talk about organizational culture and change and all of the transformative things, but we start out talking about that because that's where we come together as teams, typically on a more usual daily basis, right? But that doesn't mean everything isn't connected. It is. We're a family, our friends, the community, all of it, right? Our faith, all of it. So, but when you're trying to brute force change, right? You're trying to make an abrupt change. This is where organizations struggle. This is where people, just human beings, we struggle with change, abrupt, immediate change, right? And typically when these things happen, we are resistant to that, right? We resist change, and it's a human thing. It's, hey, this is my pattern of behavior, and now it's going to be, abruptly changed, right? And so we push up against that. We resist that. In organizations, you'll see people foot drag. It may not be if you're a leader or or an owner of an organization, it may not be that in your brain, oh, well, this isn't a big deal. And this is oftentimes where the disconnect can come in between leadership and the broader team. Is in your brain, you may have simplified this change. You may think, oh, this will be a great change, and you're excited about it. But your team, you haven't done the appropriate change management. Okay. And now you just, let's just say, introduce this to your team, right? Abruptly. Maybe in such a situation where, hey, this is what we're doing. Now, obviously, if you're an owner of business, all this sort of things, you feel obliged because it's your organization or your company, etc., to do this because it's your baby. This is yours, right? But what you have to understand is that you've allowed a certain conditioning to occur, right, within your current team, in maybe how the work is conducted and all of the facets of it, so that they become conditioned and used to this. Okay, you allowed this conditioning to occur. And if you haven't been doing gradual changes here and there in other places to where your team got used to change, right? Then when you do something significant, make a significant change, and you bring that to your team's, to their feet, and go, yo, this is what we're doing. That's an abrupt change, right? You need to go through the gates of change management, which I'm not going to get into the details of right here. But understand that abrupt change, that is brute force change, okay? Now, there's also the difference between a desired change and a change out of necessity. So if it is such that, oh my gosh, if we don't do this, then XYZ is going to happen, people, even though they resist the change, they don't like the change, it irritates them, anything that changes our routine, right? And how we operate can get under our skin, especially if we don't go through the proper change management gates. But when that happens, it's a brute force change. If it's by necessity, if that necessity is if we don't do it, then the organization is going to fold, the business is going to fold, you're more apt to get cooperation. But if you're just using that as a way to, brute force change, that's not good, right? And the other side of this is if it's a desired change from, say, the top, right, from the management side of the house, if it's a desired change there, but it's not one of necessity, I'm not saying that it isn't going to help. It probably will help, and it may be at a certain specific functional necessity, right? But you just want to do it more so than anything, and you haven't really maybe walked it around, you haven't talked with the team about something being an obstacle. Now, there are times when the team understands that a certain area needs to be fixed, right? This is a no-brainer. This is where change is easily, is more easily infused and integrated into your team, right? That happens a little bit easier because your team has seen it. In fact, they probably brought it to your attention, right? And so this may have been an ongoing communication. That's actually the most appropriate way to do those things. But if you're going to make a significant change, especially if you're trying to brute force a change, you're going to get resistance. And you're going to have, sorry folks, just what it is, you're going to get resistance because you haven't gone through the appropriate gates to kind of communicate why you're doing it and all that sort of thing. And it's a change of routine. And you have to allow, or at least you have to give your team the opportunity to adapt to the change too, right? There's an adapting mechanism that has to occur as well to change, okay? Now, that being said, if we're talking to the broader team members now, understand this, and I'll use an example. I was retired Air Force, and we moved around enough. And my children, because we moved around enough, they would, obviously they had friends where they were in one location, and then they would make new friends and so forth, right? So they adapted, they learned to adapt to the environment of change, right? Was it a brute force situation? No, it wasn't like, hey kids, we're leaving tomorrow. Okay. There was a process to this, right? and there's obviously communication, and there's obviously, you're going through all of the essential phases of a move, for example. But that's not brute force. But what it does do when you're doing change, when you're instituting change that is properly done, you are growing the mindset of your team to be more flexible, to understand that if we want to improve, then we have to change, right? There's no other way to improve without changing. And in fact, as human beings, like it or not, you may think, well, I hate change, and you may have convinced yourself of that so that anything that comes along, you just kind of trigger yourself to, to resist, right? And so that's a psychology too, that you have to kind of talk to yourself and say, well, if we want something to improve, then we're going to have to adapt, right? And we see this throughout human history, but we definitely see it from in the last, say 100 to 150 years, where we went through the Industrial Revolution and all the different gates of progress and technology, all the way up to where we're talking on our, these cell phones, and we're doing FaceTime and all these things, right? 150 years ago, we would have thought, what, right? So this has required all of us through the generations to what? Change. We're ever changing and transforming. Typically, though, the easiest change that we make are ones that we're interested in making, right? That we see value in. And that is another key element of this. If it's, well, hey, this cell phone, if you have this cell phone, you don't have to be, corded up to your wall to where you can't, leave the room you're in, right? And, well, that's an advantage. Well, that's helpful because I could be, whatever. I could be out in the park on my lunch and talk to family or friends or whatever, right? There's a flexibility that it creates, that this tool is created, right? And this is what is important to change, is communicating the change, because the brute force aspect of this is just to go, boom, this is what it is, right? Too bad, so sad, do it, right? No, folks, you got to communicate. And that essentially is kind of the difference between just, going through the normal process of change and a brute force change. A big foot stomp is communication, right? Front loading that communication and making sure that what I'm doing is in line with what I'm saying. But where the cognitive dissonance comes in, right, is when I'm saying one thing, but I'm doing an entirely different thing. Now, not only is there brute force change happening, right, but that it is not people feel set up because they feel like, well, this is what, we were going to do, but all of a sudden we decided to change at the last minute and now we're just fine. You see what I mean? So that, what was good communication, understood communication, turns into a brute force situation, a brute force change. And then the whole team, it's essentially like being on a ship and just turning the wheel, right? Turning the wheel, and everybody on the deck is thrown off, or thrown way over to the side, and they can't get their bearings, and they're out of balance. So this is the other problem with brute force change. It throws your team off balance. And what does this affect? This affects your customers. Why? Because if your team is trying to establish balance because you're making brute force changes, then what happens is that your quality suffers, your productivity suffers, your customers ultimately suffer, your business suffers. Do you think that reflects positively from the, hey, we're going to make a change? And then it becomes brute force. Now, how could this happen where a change that was maybe communicated from, say from a corporate level, say, hey, we're going to be doing these changes, da-da-da. And they're talking to multiple sites, and so they're telling the sites, "Hey, make sure your folks know, that 90 days we're going to be doing this, whatever, right?" And so the site GMs or plant managers or however your setup is, whoever the site leader is, supposed to tell the team what's going on. But let's say that one of the site leaders doesn't really give the full picture, right? Maybe because they're afraid because there will be some pushback, right? But they don't give the full picture. And then the required change time comes. the adoption, part of this, comes. And then that site, the other sites may have known about it. They were communicated and prepared and understood there was going to be change and had the chance to ask questions to alleviate concerns, and so that they could at least brace and lean into the turn. Okay. But for that one site where that site leader didn't do their due diligence, it is going to be received by their team as a brute force change. Now, this is where this, triangulation and passive aggressiveness comes in. The site leader goes, I don't know, it was just corporate, they just threw it on us, right? Now, there are a lot of teams out there who have experienced a micro or macro version of what I just told you. You may have departments who have done this relative to the site leader, right, as well. It just depends on what scale we're talking about. But this is what you see, a triangulation. Oh, I don't know. It's just changed. You know how they are. They keep throwing stuff at us, da-da-da-da-da. And then now that site leader has demonized the corporate office, who's probably been telling them for months, hey, change is coming. This is what we got to do. Tell your folks, blah, 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 the whole thing. And now the entire team, are they mad at the site leader? Oh, they're probably mildly irritated anyway, overall. But they were really mad at the organization overall, right? And when this happens, now this site leader doesn't have to feel like, oh, well, I didn't have to bear the brunt of it. I just just pushed it off. Now, that's a cheap way to go, right? That's a cheap, triangulation there. And some people might laugh and go, ha, 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 I've done that. Well, it's really the wrong way to go, folks. It's disingenuous to your team. It's just unprofessional and very poor execution of any change whatsoever. But what should be occurring is there should be a good communication flow. There should be opportunity for the team members to understand that there's a change coming. And that way there isn't this reactiveness, because when you don't do these appropriate things and that team now feels, tossed upon the seas, on the ship, and it's making a very hard turn, now customers are suffering because of it. Okay, quality, productivity, all of it, on-time delivery, all the things, right? All the KPIs. So this reverberates back, and now this site takes a hit. And if that site leader is such, and I'm obviously not saying that this is going to be true for all sites, but we have to understand that these things happen because we have people who are who do manipulative and nefarious things. Site leaders now, I don't know, it's the team, right? They're always keeping themselves in this kind of protected zone. They're telling the corporate entity, saying, I don't know, suffering, team this and the team that, and maybe the turnover now, because now they start cycling people out, whatever. And it could be a setup to turn people over that wouldn't otherwise have been necessary to let go, right? So you've got some shenanigans that go on out there, and I'm not telling you probably anything you haven't witnessed, seen, or got a whiff of at some point in your life or career. And if you haven't experienced this, keep your eyes and ears open, because this can also happen in less than dubious ways if site leaders, for example, right? Now this could be department level, this could be supervisors too, right? It doesn't matter, but I'm using the site for example. But it could also happen if the site leader just doesn't do the full due diligence, may not have a plan to kind of just pass it off in a hard way, but they may just be, let's just call it what it is, folks. They may just be lazy, right? Complacent, you want that professional word? We'll say complacent, right? And nothing worse for a broader team that is working hard to take care of customers than to have a complacent site, department, or any leader within the organization. It's nothing more difficult for folks to deal with, because there's not a reciprocation of energy. There's not the investment of time, attention, and care to the mission at hand, right? And you want your leader to be just as engaged and committed as you are if you're a team member, right? And vice versa, right? If you're a leader, you want your team to be just as committed, passionate about what you're doing as you are. But you don't get there by not communicating, and you don't get there by relying on brute force change. and you don't get there, if that brute force change is done so that it benefits any particular person or entity, either to avoid accountability or to be better off from that, in any manner, it's just unprofessional. No real leader would ever do that, and if that occurs, then that's your litmus test. Now you don't have a real leader, okay, and you don't have somebody who's actually doing the job. And in some cases, you may have customers being served by team, a broader team who actually does more to take care of the customer, and they just kind of hope that the site leader, would just take like a 11-month vacation so that they could take care of the work, right? This person now just becomes an obstruction to their ability to do the work. So anyway, there you go, folks. Those are some of the, that's definitely some pitfall areas, right? But let's not forget, team members, we also can't be foot dragging. We have to be flexible. We have to understand that the only way for us to adapt to changing environments and the necessity to change is to, open ourselves up, be flexible, and so forth. But also ask lots of questions, right? So when change is coming, don't just sit back and wait. Make sure that when you're given the opportunity to say, hey, okay, does anybody have any questions? Think about it. Think it through. Don't just kind of blow it off and go, yeah, whatever. And then the time comes for the change, and now you have questions last minute. Well, you may have questions, but you can't have the questions that you should have asked 3 months ago, 2 months ago, 2 weeks ago, right? So don't be that person or those people who are foot draggers and they just put everything off, right? Be accountable, be on target with what you're doing in the organization, right? All right, folks, hope you're having a fantastic day. Remember, hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day or more to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage one another. When you do this, not only helping to transform culture, but you're transforming your own life. But remember, we can't transform anything on the outside if we're not willing to transform on the inside, right? Super important. All right, folks, have a fantastic day. Hit like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.